Today we're going to review some literary terms for Persepolis. Hopefully you've encountered these in previous English classes or in previous units in this class, but they are important to know in terms that you can use in your essays, and they help you really analyze literature better. So setting, it is where the story takes place and the time. So it's place and time. That's really important that you don't forget that second part. Theme is the central topic of a text. It is complementary to the main idea. So this tends to be basically your thesis statement. You take the big idea of the text and then you add what is it saying about that big idea. And we'll talk about how to find that. Conflict, when someone prevents the protagonist from achieving their goals, in a nutshell. And there's 6 main types. On here I have man versus, etc. That is now politically incorrect, but if you are going to look into literary terms books, that's what you're going to see, the politically incorrect term where it's man. It should now be person versus whatever, but I wanted you to see what you would encounter in books as well. So man versus self, man versus man, man versus society, nature, machine, fate, and supernatural. I always have trouble coming up with examples of these off the top of my head. But man versus self, I would say that Gollum in Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit is an excellent idea or an excellent representation of that. He kind of has a split personality and he goes Gollum and Smeagol and he has conflicting loyalties. His brain is rattled by having his precious ring all those years. So if you haven't seen Lord of the Rings, you should probably watch it. Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, there's so many references to those texts. It might be helpful. Man versus man, so another example would be Gollum versus Frodo, or Voldemort versus Harry. It's interesting because everyone calls Voldemort Voldemort, but it's a French term, and so you're not supposed to pronounce the T. Just kind of interesting because even in the movies they messed it up. Man versus society. I guess man versus self could also be Castaway, but man versus society, you see that maybe with superhero books because you have the superhero against the society or the bad guy against society trying to take over. Man versus nature, that is also a Castaway situation, or any of those reality TV shows where they have to survive. Survivor, I think, is the name of that show. Didn't watch it, actually. Man versus Machine, I always think of the Terminator with that, but you could also look at Star Wars. That's another show that you should watch, or set of movies that you should watch, because there's so many references to them. And like so many man versus machines, it's not just the droids, but Darth Vader is part machine, and even Luke is part machine. So it's kind of interesting. Man versus fate / supernatural, Harry Potter with his fate, Frodo. It's a lot in the fantasy genre. There's the question, can you escape your fate? One author who I love from the 19th century is Charles Dickens, and what I love about his books is he takes like 3 different storylines of characters who don't interact at all, and then they all come together, and it was like fated for them to be together in the end and for their stories to come together, which is just really cool to me. And my definition of cool is different from yours. But those are the 6 types of conflict. Characterization, we did cover this earlier, but I will cover it again in this presentation because it's always good to hear it again. You have direct or explicit characterization. That's when someone tells you directly about that character. So for instance, if I were to tell you, I like to knit, that is direct characterization. You know I knit. Indirect or implicit characterization is if you saw that my closet at school had 1 full shelf of yarn, you might be like, I wonder if Miss Stevens likes to knit. Maybe she does. Or maybe she likes to make dream catchers, or maybe she crochets or weaves. Who knows? And so what's interesting about indirect characterization is you you as the reader get to deduce or decide who that character is. And that's how we all have different perspectives of the characters that we read about. Because when one character does one action, we use that indirect characterization to make assumptions. And so we read the book slightly differently, even though all the words are the same, which I think is fascinating. And I love reading about how you guys interpret characters differently. You have the major or central characters, obviously the people we see the most, or the characters we see the most, and the minor characters who help the major characters and move the plot forward. These next 4 terms students confuse a lot, so hopefully you guys will see the difference. Dynamic and static has to do with change. Dynamic means you change over time. So Don Quixote, who is the main protagonist of Don Quixote, the first modern novel in Western civilization in Spain, so it wasn't even in the English language, he's dynamic. He goes from being crazy in the beginning to being the most sane character at the end. A static character does not change over time. So Sherlock Holmes, even though he's a protagonist, he doesn't change. And so that's kind of interesting to know. A round character is basically a character that you read about who has such a complex personality that they could be your friend sitting right next to you. A flat character only has one characteristic, which is very similar to a stock character. And they're conventional or stereotypical. A flat character really only has one characteristic, like the court jester, to entertain the king, whereas a stock character can be round or dynamic as well, but they also have certain conventions, like the femme fatale. So if you watched the series La Femme Nikita, she's a femme fatale. I'm trying to think of other examples. Medusa is an example of a femme fatale. Mermaids in mythology, they're usually very attractive, but then they'll kill you, so watch yourself. The private eye, that's like Sherlock Holmes. The mad scientist, that's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or Frankenstein. And then there's the faithful sidekicks. So you see that in superhero comics a lot, is someone who's always standing by and helping. Or Harry Potter has Ron and Hermione, and Frodo has the Fellowship, and Bilbo has, who does Bilbo have? Frodo mostly has Sam. Bilbo has the dwarves. Anyhow, and then we have like Princess Leia and Luke, and Han Solo, and Han Solo has Chewbacca, who's his faithful sidekick, so lots of those. Protagonist is the hero, and you can have an anti-hero who's the protagonist but is not necessarily a good guy, and that's more like Dexter Morgan, or if you watched Breaking Bad, the main character in that. I did not watch very much of that. Antagonist is opposite the protagonist, usually the bad guy. Another anti-hero is Maleficent, if you've seen that Disney movie. Foil are characters who contrast with one another. So Malfoy contrasts with Harry in Harry Potter. We have Luke contrasting with Darth Vader. We have, Gollum contrasting with Frodo or Bilbo. There's a lot of character foils out in the world. And then a symbolic character represents a major idea of the society. That one's really hard to come up with. But you can think about that for Persepolis. Is there a symbolic character in this book? And they might be a minor character. And I think this is the last slide. So this is a shorter presentation. Text structure. It's how the text is organized or sequenced. Think the plot. And think the language, like the paragraphs. Is there a lot of dialogue? Those kind of things. Symbolism. Symbols to represent ideas or qualities. So if you look at the United States flag, we have 13 lines to represent the 13 colonies, and 50 stars to represent each state. And there's more symbolism in the flag. A rose represents love, to be cliche. There are lots of symbols out there. If you make a V with your two fingers, that's the peace sign. So that's also a symbol. I don't know why that's peace. It doesn't really make sense. Maybe someone can explain that to me. An allusion is a reference to something without it being explicitly stated. So a famous allusion, that I can think of is the word quixotic. And that is in the English language, and it means it's a reference to Don Quixote, meaning it's kind of an out there idea, something you're not used to hearing. And that's why it's important to study literature and also to be well versed in pop culture, because there are allusions all the time. In fact, there are allusions to like TikTok, and I'm not familiar with them. Like, I think there was emo girl versus someone else for a spirit day, and I had no idea what that was alluding to. So I even need to spruce up on that. Complex characters has conflicting motivations, multiple roles and responsibilities. They're usually dynamic and or around. And those can be the protagonists, and they're a big role in the book. So that's a quick review of literary terms that you will need for this unit.